So as I was saying, this is on the other side of the size and multi-scale issue. So we just heard about microbial evolution, and now we're going to hear about interactions of electrons and protons. So completely different length scale. And I'm going to tell you about how we've used blue waters to study the non-Born-Oppenheimer effects between electrons and protons. So standard electronic structure packages treat nuclei as classical point charges. And they invoke the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, the separation between nuclei and electrons. And this assumes that the electrons move much faster than the nuclei, and so they can respond instantaneously to motions of the nuclei. So what typically happens in these kinds of packages is you're solving a time-independent Schrodinger equation, and your wave function depends explicitly on the electronic coordinates, so what I call RE here, and it depends parametrically on the classical coordinates, what's called RC here. So what we do is we solve the electronic Schrodinger equation for each configuration of the nuclei. We get an electronic wave function and an energy, and we do this for all the different possible nuclear configurations, and then we get a potential energy surface, E, which depends on all of the nuclear coordinates. So that's the standard classical and Born-Oppenheimer approximation situation. So the key challenge that we are trying to address is to develop methods that include the nuclear quantum effects and non-Born-Oppenheimer effects between select nuclei and electrons in these electronic structure calculations. So why do we want to do this? Well, nuclear quantum effects are important throughout chemistry and biology. Here are some examples. In a molecule, if you look at the vibrations, we need to worry about zero-point energy effects in vibrationally excited states. If we're looking at hydrogen-bonded systems, say just even a cluster of water, those hydrogen bonding interactions also exhibit nuclear quantum effects. And finally, there's hydrogen tunneling. Here's an example of malonaldehyde. Here, the hydrogen is transferring between two oxygens. And that's a hydrogen tunneling effect. That means that the hydrogen is actually going through the barrier rather than over the barrier. And in fact, that tunneling splitting has been measured experimentally to be around 22 wave numbers. So these are all examples where treating nuclei as classical point charges will simply fail. So the other issue is non-Born-Oppenheimer effects. And this is maybe a little bit less obvious, but it's very important in a certain class of reactions called proton-coupled electron transfer, or PCET. In these reactions, we have an electron and a proton transferring simultaneously, often between different donors and acceptors. And over the past 15 years or so, my group has been developing a general theory for these kinds of PCET reactions. And what we know is that the electrons and the transferring proton must be treated quantum mechanically, that hydrogen tunneling is important. And we also know that non-Born-Oppenheimer effects are significant. These are often called non-adiabatic effects, so non-adiabatic effects between the electrons and the proton. That's what's of interest to us. And what we've shown is that in these kinds of reactions, the proton tunneling time can actually be faster than the electronic transition time. So this is the opposite of the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. So we can't just assume the electrons are responding instantaneously to the nuclei, because we're not in that regime. And this is not some sort of exotic type of reaction that only occurs in very special situations. In fact, it occurs in solution, in electrochemistry, and in enzymes. It actually occurs in many, many different places. So these PCET reactions are significant in biology, in photosynthesis, in respiration, and enzymes. Here are some examples. This is a photosynthesis, and this is an enzyme. And in both cases, you can see there are electrons. If you look, you can see in this case, the electrons are cyan, I believe, and the protons are yellow. You've got different electrons and protons. These are very complicated mechanisms. So the electrons and protons are being transferred in many different places and in many different directions. But understanding that fundamental electron-proton interaction and how they're coupled is key to understanding these more complicated biological systems. And PCET is also important in chemical systems, such as solar cells and other energy devices. Here's an example of a solar panel. And if you zoom in and you look just at a solar cell, that's this picture here, we can see that electrons and protons are doing everything here too. So what happens in this this is just a schematic of a solar cell. The sunlight is absorbed by the photoanode material. Water is split into oxygen and protons. Then the protons are transported through a membrane onto the other side, where now they're actually combined with electrons to make molecular hydrogen. So what's happened here is we've taken sunlight and we've converted that energy into molecular bond energy in a hydrogen molecule. And this is a schematic from an NSF center called Powering the Planet. My group is part of it, and many, many other people are also part of this center. And our focus has been on these white blobs here. Those are actually catalysts for hydrogen production. So what's happening here, now they're rose-colored because that shows up better. These catalysts are taking electrons from an electrode, and they're taking protons from solution and creating molecular hydrogen. So our goal in the center is to design molecular electrocatalysts that do this better. So our objective is we want them to be fast, so we want them to have a high turnover frequency, and we want them to require a small amount of energy input, so a low overpotential. And we'd also like them to be made up of environmentally friendly, cost-effective, and earth-abundant materials. So that's one direction that we're pursuing in my group. But to do this, we need to use the PCET theory I mentioned that we've been developing for many years. And I'm not going to go into the details of this PCET theory, but just to point out a few key elements. One is that we need to treat the hydrogen nucleus quantum mechanically. So no classical point charges, it's not going to work here. Typically, these reactions are non-adiabatic, so there are non-Born-Oppenheimer effects that are playing an important role. Because of that, we can actually use Fermi's golden rule and derive rate constants in various well-defined regimes. This is one of the rate constants. I'm not going to go into all of the details of what all these symbols mean, but the main point for this talk is that non-Born-Oppenheimer methods need to be used to calculate the input quantities for these rate expressions. So if we want to be able to study PCET reactions, we need non-Born-Oppenheimer methods. And that leads to our development of the nuclear electronic orbital, or NEO method, which avoids the Born-Oppenheimer separation between electrons and select quantum nuclei. So we treat only the key hydrogen nuclei quantum mechanically, so those involved in hydrogen bonding interactions or in hydrogen transfer. We retain at least 2 classical nuclei to avoid complications with translations and rotations. So our goal here is then to solve a mixed nuclear electronic time-independent Schrödinger equation with molecular orbital methods. So in NEO, we first start out by dividing the system into our electrons, our quantum protons, and our classical nuclei. Those are shown down here. And then we have a Hamiltonian. The top line is just your standard terms in an electronic structure calculation. Then the blue terms are the analogous terms for the quantum nuclei. And the red term is the interaction between the electrons and the quantum nuclei. That's actually the term that makes this a hard problem. And so the goal then is to solve the Schrödinger equation at the bottom. So it's the same Schrödinger equation I showed you before, except now we've taken a few of the nuclei and we call them RP. Those are protons. They're being treated quantum mechanically, and they're put on the other side of the semicolon. So now our wave function depends explicitly on the electron coordinates and those coordinates of those special quantum nuclei. So the easiest wave function to come up with is called just a Hartree-Fock. A mean field wave function is the product of an electronic and a nuclear Slater determinant. And then we can calculate the energy by taking the expectation value of that Hamiltonian on the previous slide. We use Gaussian basis sets for the electrons and the nuclei. We use the variational method to minimize the energy, and we get a bunch of equations for the electrons and the quantum protons. It's actually very similar to what's done in normal Hartree-Fock theory, but we just have an extra set of equations for the quantum nuclei, and then we have some coupling terms. So this is really easy to do, but unfortunately it doesn't work very well, because we're not adequately describing the electron-proton correlation. So what happens is our nuclear densities, our protons, are too localized, and we get completely wrong frequencies. They're much too high, and this affects everything, the geometries, the energies, the couplings, the tunneling splitting. So this is really an inadequate level of theory. So we went on and we developed an explicitly correlated method, where we multiply this Hartree-Fock wave function by a term that's called a geminal function, and this depends on the distances between the electrons and the protons. And we do the same thing. We take the expectation value of the Hamiltonian, but now we're using this new wave function instead of the other one. We use the variational method again. We get very complicated equations, but we can solve them computationally. And the advantage is that this method provides accurate nuclear wave functions, but unfortunately it's very computationally expensive. This led us to a new method, which is the same as the other ones, was XCHF. Now we've added an R for reduced XCHF. Before, we were treating all of the electrons being correlated to the quantum nucleus, and now we're saying let's only correlate a subset of these electronic orbitals to the quantum nucleus. This leads to a dramatic increase in computational tractability and actually enhanced accuracy as well. You don't usually get both, but in this case you do for reasons I won't go into here. And we've applied this to positronic systems, so we can couple a positron to one electron get positronium, and then we've shown that this works very well. We've compared it to highly accurate calculations. We get accurate densities and annihilation rates. But what we really want to do is study those PCET systems I talked about at the beginning, the ones that occur in photosynthesis and solar cells and all that. But to do that, we need to treat protons quantum mechanically, not positrons, and we also need to couple more orbitals. And it turns out it's more expensive. So the bottleneck of all of this is that we have a large number of 2, 3, 4, and 5 particle integrals. And these are just matrix elements of the Hamiltonian over that explicitly correlated wave function. And the scaling is really not so good. So for XCHF, it goes as n to the 8th. N is the number of electronic basis functions. If we use our new one with the R for reduced XCHF, we get down to n to the 6th, but it's still really not all that good. And the scaling can be alleviated a little bit. We've got ways to do that using restricted basis sets and other tricks, but it's still very computationally expensive. So that's why we needed Blue Waters to run these kinds of calculations. They require a large number of processors, a substantial amount of memory. And as I said, the main computational expense is these multi-particle integrals. And they have to be calculated and stored in memory or on disk. And they can be calculated independently. So this means that it's embarrassingly parallelizable. So it's very easy to parallelize. We can use a hybrid MPI and OpenMP. This reduces the need to store all the integrals on a single node, and instead we can partition the calculation and the storage over many nodes. And Blue Waters allows us to use many nodes simultaneously. So that's the big advantage there, that we can split both the calculation and the storage over many nodes. So our in-house code has demonstrated excellent scaling. It's because, as I said, everything can be done independently. So we get the maximum benefit from being able to use this large number of nodes simultaneously. And now I'll show just a couple of preliminary results. I'll say that we've only had this allocation for a couple months, so we don't have final results yet. But this is a molecule HCN. We treat the proton, the H, quantum mechanically, and all the electrons, there are 14 of them, those are also treated quantum mechanically. The nitrogen and the carbon are just point charges, as usual. And what we did is we looked at the stretching frequency of the CH. And what you can see from this table here is you can see that if we do what we call NEO-Hartree-Fock, that's the original mean field method I talked about, we get a frequency of 5,000 wave numbers. That's much too high if we compare it to what we know is the right answer, the grid-based answer down here. That's 3,500 wave numbers. So that's a huge error. If we use our new RXCHF methods, we get much closer. So that's a huge benefit, a huge improvement in the frequency. You can see why we have to go beyond mean field. This is also shown pictorially in this graph right here. So that's very encouraging. Now we went on to a bigger molecule. Now we have 20 electrons. This is FHF minus. So again, we have just the middle proton is quantum mechanical. The 2 fluorines are just classical point charges. We have 20 electrons, 1 quantum proton. And what you can see here is that we need a large number of integrals that we need to calculate and store. So this is just giving you an example of what we're dealing with. And the calculations are currently in progress on Blue Waters. In fact, the integrals are already calculated, but now we're going through the self-consistent field procedure. So we know that it's manageable, we know that it's doable, but at the same time, it's obviously very expensive, and we'd like to go beyond 20 electrons. So what we're doing at the same time is we're developing new algorithms that are going to make all of this much faster, decrease the cost, so that with Blue Waters, we can look at much larger molecules. So to summarize, I've told you about this NEO method that we've developed that incorporates both nuclear quantum effects and non-Born-Oppenheimer effects between electrons and select protons. We've developed these explicitly correlated wave functions that have been shown to be accurate, but they're computationally expensive, with the bottleneck being this calculation and storage of a large number of multi-particle integrals. But Blue Waters is allowing us to address this challenge. We're able to run with a large number of nodes simultaneously. And our current applications to molecular systems with protons are going right now. They're ongoing. And the preliminary results so far are promising. But at the same time, we realize we need to develop the algorithms together with using fast computers. So we're also developing faster integral code and also some algorithmic enhancements that will allow us to avoid integral screening and other tricks that will allow us to look at larger systems. So our future direction is really to to combine this explicitly correlated method with what are called multi-configurational methods, so we can study those types of non-Born-Oppenheimer systems that I talked about at the beginning, the PCET reactions that occur. We have electrons and protons transferring in complex environments. That's where we're heading. That's where the non-Born-Oppenheimer effects are going to be important. That's where we're going to need a method like this. And so as we move on and develop the methods and test them and validate them on Blue Waters, we will move in that direction. So I want to end by acknowledging the people who did the work. The NEO method has been developed by all of these people in one way or another. Chet Swalina, Mike Pack, and Andrew Serjusing have done a lot of the coding. Andrew, in particular, has done coded a large part of this and done all of the parallelization that I talked about. He's the one who's running the code on Blue Waters. He's the one who knows all of the he has the technical expertise and has learned all of this along the way. He's actually just defended his thesis last week. So all of this method was, all of this work was funded by a combination of Air Force and NSF, and we started out running on the Garnet computer and more recently moved on to Blue Waters. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions.